How many of you have seen headlines like these? Bullying is a serious public health problem, experts say.
School bullying linked to poor academic achievement.
Are we too quick to cry bully?
After years of alleged bullying, an Ohio teen killed herself. Is her school district responsible?
Stories about bullying are common in the media, and we often talk about bullying in schools. But are we getting any closer to a solution?
Jen and I are here today to share some of the most compelling findings from our research over the past 20 years. In particular, we will dispel the myth that schools should be more concerned about targets of bullying than perpetrators of bullying. And we will talk about just how important it is for schools to understand the bullying experiences among their students.
For those of you who are educators, the following story might sound familiar. Marla is a 5th grade student in a local school. She's creative, she's thoughtful, and she likes basketball. She's also being bullied by another student at her school named Jeremy. At first, he made fun of her clothes during math class, and then he ran up behind her during PE class and yelled in her ear. And one day in the lunchroom, he shoved her lunch tray and the food spilled all over her shirt. Marla told her teacher each time these things happened, and the teacher told the vice principal. The vice principal called Jeremy into his office and called home to his parents and gave Jeremy a detention. These are the kinds of stories that Melissa and I often hear when we go into schools. It's common for administrators and teachers to administer disciplinary consequences to students who are involved in bullying. That's a typical response. But there's reason for this to give you pause.
It's not difficult to find news headlines about bullying and suicide. And like the one we showed, they focus on targets of bullying. However, the news headlines are only telling part of the story. Along with colleagues, I analyzed all of the major studies on bullying and suicide. We found that students involved in bullying in any way, as targets or perpetrators, were more likely to consider and to attempt suicide than students who were not involved in bullying. And the students who were at greatest risk of all for considering and attempting suicide were those who were both targeted by and perpetrated bullying. So, the headlines are misleading.
There are, of course, many reasons that the same students who are involved in bullying might also consider or attempt suicide. For example, mental health problems are related to both suicide and to bullying.
A factor that's talked about much less frequently is students' exposure to other forms of victimization, like child abuse and neglect. In a study of elementary school students who lived in a city with crime rates much higher than the national average, we found that among students uninvolved in bullying, 10% reported child maltreatment, 28% reported witnessing violence, like community violence or domestic violence, and 3% reported sexual victimization. Let's now compare this to targets of bullying. As you can see, among targets of bullying, 35% reported child abuse and neglect. 41% reported witnessing violence, and 12% reported sexual victimization. Well, it might not come as a surprise to you that targets of bullying also experience higher rates of victimization. But what about perpetrators? 24% of perpetrators reported child maltreatment. 61% reported witnessing violence. And 11% reported sexual victimization. Let that sink in for a minute. That means that students involved in bullying in any way are more likely to experience victimization in the home and in the community. We've found similar patterns for other forms of victimization as well, like dating violence and sexual harassment. So what does this mean for schools? Well, it means when schools are working with students involved in bullying, it's important to assess for other victimization exposures, or you might be missing a critical factor.
Think back now to that story about Marla and Jeremy. They are both at greater risk for considering or attempting suicide, and they are both at greater risk for exposure to child abuse, neglect, and dating violence. Our hope is that this information will lead you to think differently about how to support students who are involved in bullying and not relying on disciplinary policies. And we've partnered with schools to do just that. When Melissa and I go into schools, we work with schools on developing more supportive and effective strategies for responding to bullying as it's occurring and to respond to the specific needs of students within the context of the specific school that they're a part of.
First, we always recommend that schools conduct a comprehensive bullying survey to find out which students are experiencing bullying, where it's occurring, when in the school day it's most common, and how adults in the schools are responding. We work with schools to implement these surveys and then to identify school-specific strategies to more effectively address bullying.
For example, in one of the schools that we went into, students said that they were often being bullied in their classrooms. When we brought that information back to teachers, some teachers were really surprised to hear that students were being bullied in their classrooms and said that they didn't even know it was happening. Other teachers said that they knew that bullying was happening in their classrooms, but they didn't know what to do about it or how to respond. When we came in with the information from students, we were able to have powerful conversations with teachers about what they could do to identify bullying when it was happening and to respond more effectively on the spot when it was occurring.
Schools are often not aware what the most common form of bullying is in the school, and this is another way in which surveys can be helpful. In one partner school, administrators and teachers thought that cyberbullying was the most common form of bullying. And this makes sense, given the number of news headlines we all see about cyberbullying. However, when we asked students, they said that rumors and gossip spreading were the most common forms of bullying. Interestingly, research also shows that cyberbullying is in fact less common than in-person and in-school bullying. Results from this survey led to shifts in conversations about prevention at this particular school.
One wrinkle that our team has found particularly important is that as we've gone into schools and done surveys, we've learned that the way we ask students questions about being bullied impacts the answers that we get back. So for example, if we go into a school and say, "Have you been bullied?" a different group of students will say yes to that question than if we go into schools and say, "Have you experienced repeated victimization, like being teased or excluded or pushed or shoved, that was done on purpose by someone who's more powerful than you, such that you can't make it stop," which is the definition of bullying that's used by legislators and educators. And what we've learned is that we recommend that schools not use the word bully in their surveys when they're talking to students, but that they ask about all of the defining qualities of bullying, of course not as one question, and that gives a chance to make sure that students and educators are on the same page when students are responding to questions.
Right. So this means the way you ask your students questions about bullying really matters.
The challenge then is figuring out how we can stop bullying. Given what we know about the risk factors associated with bullying, how challenging it can be to measure and ask about, and the potential devastating consequences. So here are 3 recommendations for schools.
First, there are a large number of prevention and intervention efforts available to schools, but most are not well researched, and many, unfortunately, don't work. There are 2 strategies we know that can be effective: social emotional learning programs and those aimed at bystanders. Bystanders are students who witness bullying and can intervene at critical points to stop it if they have the skills and the confidence to do so. In general, evidence-based programs are most likely to be successful in schools, especially if they're implemented as they're intended to be implemented.
Second, we recommend that schools engage in developmentally appropriate interventions for students. For example, very young students are still learning about how power dynamics work in relationships. And when young children engage in behaviors that some would call bullying, we encourage educators to see these as important opportunities to teach young children about how to build healthy relationships, how to engage in effective conflict resolution, and about their own self-regulation. In contrast, at the other end of the age range, we know that our bullying prevention programs are more effective for younger children than they are for adolescents. And we encourage educators to think about what they need to do when they're speaking to adolescents to make interventions more effective. For example, you could imagine how an intervention for Marla and Jeremy would need to look different if they were 10th graders than if they're 5th graders. We need to do a better job of talking to adolescents about the kinds of victimization that are most common in adolescence, including homophobic bullying, sexual harassment, and dating violence. Adolescents are also ready to have conversations about the broader societal structures like racism and sexism that reinforce bullying, and to have conversations about the very real challenges to standing up to peers and intervening as a bystander.
Third, we recommend that adults pay attention to the wide range of bullying experiences across students and across schools. The most effective individual interventions are those that address the unique needs of students, including potentially other victimization exposures. The most effective prevention programs are those that address the unique needs of schools, taking into account school climate and culture, as well as resources. As we all know, a one-size-fits-all approach certainly doesn't work for clothes, and it also doesn't work for bullying prevention.
Look, this means that we need to stop engaging in disciplinary actions and zero-tolerance policies that we know don't stop bullying, and they never address the underlying needs of students.
If we know that students who perpetrate bullying are at increased risk for attempting or considering suicide, we must act on that knowledge to help them too, not just targets.
If we know that students are being bullied in their classrooms, then we need to support teachers in responding on the spot to bullying behaviors that they see occurring.
And we need to be continually asking students about their experiences to find out what they need and whether prevention and intervention efforts are effectively addressing these needs.
Thank you.